Hello, my name is Tamal Pilla with the Center for Presidential History at SMU. Joined today by David Leonhardt, senior writer for the New York Times, author for The Morning, which is New York Times' flagship daily newsletter, as well as a former Pulitzer Prize winner in commentary. Mr. Leonhardt will be joining us to discuss his book at SMU on November 13th at 6 p.m. in McCord Auditorium. Mr. Leonhardt, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tamal.
Now, Mr. Leonhardt, in the intro, I traditionally mention the title of the book, but in this case, I didn't because I wanted to lead with the title, and that is "Ours Was the Shining Future." Can you walk me through how you came to that title, what it really means to the book?
Yes, absolutely. So the phrase American Dream, which we all now know very well, is almost a century old. A historian named James Truslow Adams coined the phrase in 1931, which is sort of remarkable because it's obviously an optimistic phrase, but he coined it during the Great Depression. And he wrote a book in which he described the American dream as the United States' most important contribution to the world. And he described it as that American dream of a better, richer, happier life for all our citizens of every rank. And I think that's actually still quite a nice definition. Better, richer, happier. The idea is that people make progress over time. Their own life gets better. Their children's lives are better than their own lives. That is the idea of the American dream. And he also specifically said all our citizens of every rank. He made clear that this was an expansive, inclusive dream. And Adam ends his book, the book that coins the phrase American Dream, by quoting another author, an immigrant named Mary Antin, who had fled Russia, pogroms in Russia, and had come to the United States knowing no English. And she learned English in the Boston public school system, and she learned to read at the Boston Public Library. And she went on to become a celebrated writer. And she wrote her own memoir in which she talked about how this had been possible in the United States. And Adams ends his book, Defining the American Dream, by quoting Mary Antin. And she is sitting on the steps of the Boston Public Library looking up at it. And she's talking about her hope for her future here in the United States. And she says, "Mine is the shining future." And so my title is a riff off that. It expands it from mine to ours to talk about our country. And it changes is to was to reflect the fact that life is no longer getting better at the pace that it used to, and the fact that many Americans are frustrated.
Sure. Yeah. Now I have to ask Mr. Leonhardt, because we are the Center for Presidential History, how have you seen the agendas of sort of past U.S. presidents shape the decline of the American dream over time, if at all?
Yes, no, I'm glad you asked that. That is not a hard question. Presidents play a big role in this book because I believe that politics and policy really shape the economy. People sometimes claim the economy is just a free market that exists on its own. But history has a different lesson, which is our politics and our policy really shape our economic interactions. And so I would say that there are many presidents who play roles in the book, but three above all. During the 1930s and 40s, FDR responds to the Depression, as is well known, by implementing the New Deal. And the New Deal had a lot of different programs. Some of them failed, quite frankly, but enough of them succeeded that it worked. And there were both the short-term programs to try to resuscitate the economy, and then there were specific policies meant to make the fruits of our economic growth be shared more widely. And I think nothing is more important than the fact that in the 19-teens and 20s, basically labor unions in this country lost every fight that they ever tried to make. They couldn't organize. Companies just refused to negotiate with them. And FDR's policies basically made it possible for workers to organize in the 30s and 40s and really helped create this boom, this mass prosperity. Then comes Dwight Eisenhower, who himself plays a very important role. Dwight Eisenhower is the first Republican president to take office in 20 years in 1952. There are certain more radical parts of the Republican Party at that point that really wanted him to try to undo much of the FDR legacy. And Eisenhower didn't. He cut some spending. He was definitely more conservative than FDR and Truman. But mostly he ratified this idea of a high-wage economy. And then he even went further than FDR and Truman in one specific area, which is investment in the future. Eisenhower substantially increased the spending on research and development that the federal government did, which actually isn't that expensive. He also substantially increased spending on things like highways. He built the interstate highway system, and he substantially increased spending on education, partly to respond to the Soviet threat. And then the final president is Ronald Reagan, who undid a lot of the legacy of Eisenhower and FDR. And he moved us much more toward a laissez-faire economy. And look, I think it was a reasonable theory for someone to have, given the struggles of the 1970s, that the shift that Reagan put in place might work. And he and his allies promised that it would lead to this new era of unmatched prosperity for everybody. And it hasn't. Whether you look at income, whether you look at wealth, whether you look at life expectancy, the period since the 1980s really has been a period much less good for most Americans than the period before 1980. The one exception is the period since 1980 has been very good for wealthy people. And so Reagan's policies, they're not the only reason, but Reagan's policies played a very significant role shifting the US economy toward a more unequal economy.
Gotcha. I'm actually going to skip ahead in my list of questions because you mentioned something in that response, which was the organization of labor. Now, the subtitle of the book is The Story of the American Dream. But I want to talk about the story of the American Labor Union. Now, last year we saw what a lot of people are calling the union boom, right? Starbucks was big in the headlines, Trader Joe's, REI, Medieval Times. Organizations like that had a lot of labor organization, right? Do you see some hope for the American Labor Union in America's future?
So first of all, I want to say two things about labor unions, and then I'll directly answer your question. I've been in a union. I've been a manager who manages people in labor unions. In fact, I still am today. And I am well aware that unions are flawed. I've had my own frustrations with unions, both as a member and as a manager. The way I think about it is corporations are also flawed. Corporations often try to hold wages down as low as they can. And so if you have flawed corporations without being checked by flawed unions, you end up with a really unequal economy. That's what we had in the 19-teens and 1920s in this country. And it's what we've had for the last 30 years or so as labor unions have shrunk. So the first point is labor unions are imperfect, but without them, you end up with a highly unequal economy. And the second point really emphasizes that you end up with a highly unequal economy. There's a really nice, rigorous piece of research by a group of economists at Princeton and Columbia, where they used Gallup polls and other records to study the effect of being in a union. And a worker who is in a union makes 10 to 20% more than an otherwise similar worker on average. And that union premium continues. And you say, well, where does that money come from? Does it come out of economic growth? For the most part, no. It comes out of executive pay and it comes out of corporate profits, which is to say, unions don't really affect the size of the economic pie, but they affect the distribution of it. They effectively shift money from relatively affluent people to workers. And so that makes sense for why the decline of unions has really led to a surge of inequality in this country. In some ways, to answer your direct question, I do think we're living through a resurgence of interest in labor unions. For workers who are already unionized, like the auto workers in Detroit, it can lead to meaningful pay increases. But I don't think we're at a turning point. It is still very easy, or at least possible, for companies that want to prevent a labor union from forming to do so. You look at some of the things that Starbucks has done. It's come up with excuses to let go its workers who are trying to organize unions. It assigns them to really unpleasant shifts, like starting at the first thing in the morning and then ending at night, and then starting again the next morning. This has been well documented. And so I think the only way we're going to get a real resurgence of labor unions is with a change in law that makes it easier for workers to join unions. And if you look back over the last 50 years, you've seen that one Democratic president after another has said that they're in favor of labor law reform: Biden, Obama, Carter, LBJ, and none of them have actually done it. And so it's just always fallen below the line of priority. I think there's a chance things are changing. You see some Republicans, including Marco Rubio, come out and say unions are really important. You see a new interest in it among many Democrats. So I think it's possible that the next time we're going to see a burst of legislation in Washington, unions might be part of it, as opposed to the repeat of what we've had again and again, which is Congress passes a bill on healthcare reform or a bill on climate or a bill on poverty or a bill to cut taxes, and they just don't quite find the time to pass a bill on unions. Weirdly, that should give us a little bit of hope. It's not like we've tried labor law reform and it's failed. As a country, we just haven't really tried it, not since FDR.
I see. Okay, so it's clear the American dream has sort of declined, right? But at times the book, excuse me, strikes me as really a faithful advocate of the American dream and its place in this nation's future. But my question really is, who do you see as the agents of that resurgence, that comeback? We talk about labor unions, but we also talk about lawmakers, right? Is it us? Is it the top 2%? Who's going to spearhead this change?
Yeah. I know there are some people who say that the American dream has always been a mirage, a false promise. And I think that's wrong. I think the American dream is real. Yes, our country has had many, many problems over the years, many injustices. The American dream has not been equally attainable for all of our citizens, to say the least. And today, it really is harder for people to have their living standards increase. I mean, if a child born in 1940 had a 92% chance of growing up to earn more money than their parents did, today for young people, it's a 50-50 proposition. And so I do think it's under threat. At the same time, I think this country has enormous strengths. And people who say, well, how is there any hope for the future? I would remind them how often political movements, grassroots political movements, have succeeded in this country. When they have set a goal, when they've tried to sway public opinion, when they've gathered people together and tried to win elections, their history is actually remarkable. Look at the civil rights movement and all that it accomplished. In the 70s, look at the disability rights movement. More recently, look at the movement for marriage equality. 20 years ago, no one would have said that same-sex marriage would be the law of the land as quickly as it was. During the Trump presidency, look at the successful grassroots effort to prevent President Trump from repealing Obamacare. That was a grassroots effort, and it worked. And these lessons aren't all only coming from the political left either. The anti-abortion movement, it didn't respond to Roe v. Wade 50 years ago by giving up on the system as rigged. It organized. It basically took over the Republican Party. It won elections in particularly in conservative states, and it changed government policy through decades of work. And so, to me, the problem is we haven't had a grassroots movement on either the political left or the political right that has been devoted to trying to lift the living standards of most Americans, particularly Americans who don't have a college degree, who are still a majority. We haven't had a movement that's been devoted to making it easier for them to go to good schools. We haven't had a movement that's been devoted to raising their wages. And so I just think if we did have such a movement, its possibility of success is real, and we shouldn't assume it couldn't work. We should just remember that we haven't really even tried it.
Now, I want to sort of back up from the book itself and take a bird's eye view of sort of the authorship of the book. Did you know who the target audience was going to be when you stepped into writing this book, or did you discover it along the way?
I almost always have the same target audience in mind, whether it's for this book or whether it's for The Morning, the newsletter I write for the Times. I think of my target audience as smart people who don't have that much background knowledge about the subject. I think too often in journalism, we basically get taken in by the jargon of experts, and we write over the heads of our readers. And that's not our readers' fault. It's our fault as journalists. I mean, think about how often you read a story about something complex, like a piece of global affairs or foreign policy or the economy, and you don't actually understand what the person writing the article is trying to say. You don't understand why A caused B, or you don't understand how we've ended up this way. And so I really set out to write a book for people who understand how important the economy is, who understand how important economic policy is, and who want to have a deeper understanding of it, and want to have a deeper understanding of it in a way that if it's explained clearly enough, they could then turn around and explain the argument to someone else. And that's basically always who I'm writing for, whether I'm writing about COVID, whether I'm writing about foreign affairs. I basically try to ask very simple questions of the people I'm interviewing. I try to dig into data and to history with an eye toward explaining it to people who are not experts. And then I try to emerge with a story and an argument that people can assess on their own, without simply saying, without using jargon, or without saying research proves this. I think logic is very important.
Yeah. Mr. Leonhardt, I want to close out with a question about your talk coming up on November 13th. Now, I'm a history student, right? But I have a lot of friends in business school, the art school, the engineering school, who look at a talk like yours, sort of a book lecture, and say, I'd rather do homework, right? What do you
Or
say?
something other than homework.
Agreed, yeah. What do you say to those kids who are sort of maybe on the fence? You know, they've seen the flyer around campus online. They're like, I don't know, not for me. What would you say to those kids?
Well, the first thing is, if you have a looming deadline for an assignment, you probably should stay home and finish your assignment.
Fair enough.
But what I would say is, look, I think many of us have a feeling that our country isn't working in some basic ways, whether you're conservative or liberal or moderate. Americans are really angry. They are screaming at each other online and in other places. It's been almost 20 years since most Americans said the country was on the right track. That's true whether we've had a Democratic president or a Republican president. And I think a central reason for why that is this stagnation in living standards. In 1980, the United States had a typical life expectancy for a rich country. Today, we have the lowest life expectancy of any rich country, lower than any country in Western Europe, lower than Canada, our neighbor, lower than Australia or Japan or South Korea. And what I've really tried to do here is explain how it is that our living standards for so many Americans have stagnated, and how we've ended up in this really frustrating place for many people. And I do it mostly not using numbers, but with some numbers, using stories and using history, and trying to do it in a way that people can grapple with on their own. And what I'll do at SMU is I'll do that similarly. I'll bring some of these stories to life. And my goal is that people emerge not so much focused on the past, but focused on an understanding of, oh, this is how we've ended up where we've ended up. And this is why it's affecting our country in so many ways. Polarization, the difficulty we have doing big things as a country anymore, the difficulty we have focusing on the future as opposed to the present. And I've been to SMU before. It's just a beautiful campus. I've enjoyed engaging with the students and faculty there, and I'm excited to come back.
Awesome. Well, hey, Mr. Leonhardt, thanks for taking the time this morning to chat with me. I'm super, super excited to see you talk November 13th, McCord Auditorium, 6 p.m. Thank you again.
Hey, thanks so much.
Sweet.